After running through the glass of my second-story window, in my sleep no less, I can't put it off any longer. It's been 26 years, but I have to remember what keeps me up nights. Any chance you know someone by the name of Jesse Nicola?
Don't matter your saint, a lover or a liar.
Son, why go looking for something you don't want to find?
Your city burning up in the fire.
Supposedly it's some sort of dark being that roams the woods.
Faces flashing
If
in
you're
the
depressed,
night.
angry, frustrated, or whatever,
You don't know about old
it
Shelly
can slip inside you and swallow your soul.
Thought I told you. It's none your damn business.
All the rivers run to the sea, yet the sea is not free.
It's always been that way, son. You could have gotten yourself killed. Or worse, Peters, Pops. You ever hear a natural?
How can something like that be completely forgotten, erased, like it never even existed? You're listening to The Preacher, The Fisherman, and The Cahaba, a dramatic, audio-based interpretation of the novel by the same title, anticipated for release in October of 2020. This tale, recounted from my hospital bed, is told in order, so if you're joining us in the middle, it may be best to start at the beginning. We'll be here when you get back. But to be fair, you may want to hurry, because like the innocence of youth, it won't likely last forever. If I lay at just the right angle, I see out this hospital window tonight. You know, it's odd. I can't see the stars here in the city, not like I used to. The light pollution, I guess. When I was young, the night was darker, and the evening sky unfolded layer upon layer with a depth and distance so unfathomable that anything seemed possible, and at the same time, wholly insignificant. Now when I look up, all I see is airplanes. I know they're still there, constellation upon constellation unseen, a tapestry as rich and deep as it is strange and distant. But I can't see them. Man has always looked up, for millennium. When did I stop? And why? When did the nighttime sky lose that almost spiritual hold on me? Hell, I don't know. Maybe we stabbed the universe in the back with a telescope, jotted down some clumsy notes to stuff into a textbook, and decided that what little we don't know, well, we'll figure it out soon enough. We're so distant from the nature we're born of, it just doesn't feel right. No, of course you're right. It wasn't always that way. There was a time when the rhythm of nature was inextricably bound to my life, and I hardly even noticed it. Until now. When lying in this lonely hospital bed, I'm realizing how far away from it I've gotten, and the price there is to pay for that mutiny. Chapter 2, Manhood by the Bale. The dawning sun slowly lifted its head and with one last great, yawning stretch, broke the crest of the mountain to burst into Saturday morning. Impatience animated my wagging knee as I waited on an overturned bucket, the brisk morning breeze slowly livening my tired senses. The rusty barbed wire fence crept up from the hollow along a steep hill from which the winding little drive had been carved. It snaked its way from tree to tree in 3 strands, long since swallowed by the hungry barks, to the top of the hill where it was tacked carefully to wooden posts. Each post hole had been dug by hand, secured with filled stones collected from the hillside and tamped with the force of an iron rod into the hard clay earth. The tired wires ended their journey at an old telephone pole, sectioned to the appropriate size for a corner post and latched with a chain to an old metal gate. The gate, once white, was now ruddy with age and crowned with a sun-bleached cow skull that seemed to smirk when you closed it, as if feeling the rush of wind on its face once more. Beyond the gate, the morning rapture of feeding brim left swirling designs on the pond's surface. This spot marked the epicenter of the small corner of the world that had dominated almost every memory of my 15 years on Earth. From this spot, I could see the floodlight of my house high up on the hill, casting an iridescent glow across the blue vinyl siding peeking out from behind the privet hedge. Just across the winding, one-lane country road sat the yellow siding and green shingle roof of Aunt Mary's house, her large kitchen window already lit as she went about preparing for another day. Before dishwashers, the best view in the house was often reserved for the window above the kitchen sink. It proved a good arrangement, as Aunt Mary spent an inordinate amount of time cleaning, washing dishes, and filling pots, and from that vantage point, she could keep careful watch over all the comings and goings down the road towards her little brother's home. The calendar read 1994, but on my short, three-house street, it felt like the last few decades had somehow floated over our hollow to settle elsewhere. Soon, the lingering darkness of dawn was pierced by the shimmering lights of a little black Nissan pickup as it careened up the hill. The truck was followed closely by two eager dogs, baying anxiously as they ran. It slowed to a stop as I rose from the bucket, placed it atop the fence post, and scampered across the road in front of the impatient vehicle. Crawling into the passenger seat, I was greeted by a deftly accurate shot of Taylor's Pride chewing tobacco into the hammered copper spittoon that sat precariously between the front seats. Uncle John had been a staunch supporter of Chattanooga Chew, but he'd been an even stauncher supporter of Free for much longer. So he had recently traded brands after meeting some fellow out in Massey who would barter cartons of free samples for fresh fish or vegetables. "Morning," he said. "Enjoy your little stroll last night?" I settled into the seat, pulling the door closed behind me before turning to him, shaking my head and reaching over my shoulder for the seatbelt. As my fingers touched the chrome of the dangling tongue, his brow furrowed and his eyes narrowed. I quickly pulled my hand away, moving it to the handle above the door instead. I'd seen that look 100 times, but I still can't explain it. It's a look I've yet to see in any other man. Stern, tempered in the fires of a vindictive realism, but highlighted with graceful swells of playfulness that also made them kind, like thunderheads gathering around the peaceful blue of a generous sea. A countenance that was seemingly unafraid of death, or, more so, one that had been well enough acquainted with it as to be dismissive. It had been years since the state passed seatbelt laws, but he still stood defiant against anyone who might tell him how to live his life. After all, he'd say, they didn't seem so worried about my safety when they dropped me off over Normandy. "Something weighing on you?" he asked as he left off the brake to send us rolling forward. "Nah, I'm just tired. Like last night, that always happens when I'm sleep deprived." I looked out the window and shook my head as we made a right-hand turn out of our gravel road, headed north. It was election time again, so emboldened by the biennial ritual, the deeply principled and, more often, those obligated by familial ties, had staked a sign in every square inch of unoccupied space in town. Occasionally, their better judgment lapsing, they'd put signs along the frontage of our little road as well. So, dropping off the shoulder of the road, Uncle John roared down the right-of-way, kicking the tail of his pickup around to ensure that each and every sign had been adequately toppled. Then he slammed on the brakes to bring the little black truck to a sliding stop on the soft grass and calmly looked over at me. His shirt was buttoned only twice, midway up, so his white chest hairs spilled out from beneath as if searching for sunlight. His hunter's orange ball cap sat ever so slightly on the top of his silvery head, as if it might, at any moment, pop off like a champagne cork. He rested his elbows on the door frame, twisted his torso towards me, and gave a nod. Scrambling, I collected all the toppled signs, careful not to impale myself on the now broken ones, and tossed them into the truck bed, safely out of sight below the black camper shell. Then, Sprinting back to the passenger seat triumphantly, I eased the door shut as Uncle John spun his tires in the grass to peel back onto the winding blacktop of the two-lane country road and sped away. "You think they'll be upset with us?" I asked. "I don't reckon." "How you figure? I mean, let me finish." I was gonna say, "I don't reckon they'll know it was us." He grinned, shoving my shoulder with his right hand. "Won't they just assume? I mean, there's only 3 houses on our road." "Hey, you said it. It's our road, ain't it?" "I'm gonna put 'em to better use anyhow." He turned to me with a wide smile. "They'll make fine bean poles, don't you think?" A few miles later, he eased off the road onto Lake in the Hills Drive, which, as one might expect, is a drive that ends at a lake in the hills. The people of Shiloh's Beat are a practical bunch, if not always the most creative. More than a decade back, Uncle John had negotiated the use of some property there from an elderly widow in exchange for the task of keeping it up. It would be a rare day that didn't see him visit the property at least once, and during the weekends, I'd often join him. We eased off the steep shoulder from the road through the open mouth of an old aluminum gate and into the pasture, the tires crunching atop the prickly stubs of cut fescue. The field set about a mile northeast of home as the crow flies, 10-minute drive, or about a 1.5-hour walk by the creek. The land sloped gently down from the gate, past Uncle John's garden plot, to a dilapidated barn near the back of the property. Its old, ruddy wooden slats expanded and contracted in the gentle breeze like a living, breathing organism, creaking and screeching, bemoaning its tired old bones as it looked out over the hayfield below. We came to a halt at the edge of the garden, beneath a giant black jack oak, where I stepped out from the truck and shut the door behind me. Although the nights were growing cooler, the days were still hot and humid, and there had been enough rain to sustain a late-season hay cutting. I looked across the field at the 200 square bales of hay laid out in long rows, like headstones in a cemetery, and hoped that we had some help on the way. But as it turns out, we weren't the first to the field this morning. By the still dim light of the rising sun, we could just make out the distinctive silhouette of another man, already hard at work. Alabama has a bad reputation, albeit well earned, for humidity. This particular morning, the dew was so thick that my jeans were soaked through near to the knee as we made our way across the freshly mowed field towards a man in the distance. He was arched over with his slight frame straining against the weight of a damp bale as we approached. What may have been a dry 30 pounds during the hot afternoon was probably a soggy 200 pounds this dewy morning. As Uncle John and I arrived by his side, one of the strings snapped and the liberated bale sprang out like an accordion onto the ground. Shaking his head, the man looked at his wristwatch, gave a defeated glance up towards the field, and grimaced as he did the math. He probably only stood 5'8" in his prime, and had grown progressively shorter ever since, as his spine compressed and his shoulders lurched forward. He listed slightly to one side when he walked, a little shaky, but hard as iron, like a snarled old gate hinge still clinging to the post. "Morning, Pops. Nothing doing?" Uncle John said as he slapped him on the back, practically knocking him off his feet. "Nah," mumbled Pops, before snake spinning a black rope of tobacco through his front teeth. He was the last of the bunch still in possession of real teeth. Not all of them, mind you, but enough to bite off a plug of tobacco and hold it in place. Defeated, he headed towards his little red Toyota pickup, which was parked in the shade of the nearby wood line. Reaching behind the seat, he pulled out a plastic gallon milk jug filled with water the night before and stuffed in the freezer till morning. That way the hot sun would melt it bit by bit for steady swigs of frigid water all day. He took a gratifying swallow and wiped the stubble of his 5-day beard with the sleeve of his plaid shirt, then hooked his thumbs inside the straps of his overalls. Just then, a gray and blue two-tone Chevy came bouncing through the gate and rolled to a stop beside us. Peter stepped out of the driver's seat, pressing a blue bandana against his perspiring forehead with one hand and, as always, holding a mellow yellow in the other. "Well, "Glad to see you're still on the wagon," Uncle John said, reaching out a hand in greeting. "That crap will kill you too, you know." Peters stuffed the bandana into his shirt pocket and clasped Uncle John's hand, letting out a whistle as he looked out across the bales. "Well, you best be getting on with it quick, else this job may get me first." Uncle John laughed loudly as he shook his head. Peter's thin frame, the reflection of a life hard lived, leaned back against his truck. Never dismissive, he acknowledged me with a warm grin and a nod. All the while, the sun had continued creeping up above the trees to warm the field. Hazy steam rose from the bales as the morning dew evaporated, lightening them with an amazing quickness. It wasn't long before John slapped the hood of Peter's Chevy, ran his pointer finger in a circle overhead, and said, "All right, ladies, let's get a move on." They all wore long pants and sleeves when they worked. Firstly, to protect them from the sun, and secondly, to keep their forearms from being shredded to pieces by the bristly bales of hay. Uncle John shook his head as I peeled off my white t-shirt and tossed it into the truck. Then I pulled my thin leather gloves from the back pocket of my jeans, slapping them against my palm before sliding them on. The summer of hauling hay in the near 100-degree heat was the ultimate workout, so I felt as strong and fit as I'd ever been. And this deep in the year, flush with pigment, my chances of getting burned were next to nil. Uncle John opened the driver's side door of Peter's truck and hopped inside as if he owned it. I leapt over the side and into the bed while Pops and Peter spread out on either side of the open tailgate. When you run a small operation like ours, there are no gooseneck trailers, no immigrant workers, no dignity, and on most occasions no good sense. Just a pickup truck and 4 men. One would drive the truck slowly between 2 rows of hay bales while 2 would walk beside it, tossing the bales from the ground up onto the tailgate. Then the last poor, unfortunate sucker would stand in the truck bed, grabbing bales as quickly as 2 men could toss them and stacking them neatly. That sucker, of course, was me. Soon, I'd completed the first row, tucking the bales tightly into the bed of the old Chevy, 4 cross edgeways and flush against the cab. On top of that, I laid 1 flat in the middle, perpendicular to the first, and flanked it on both sides with 2 more bales laid parallel to the cab, overhanging the edge. Finally, the top row was composed of 5 bales laid flat across, perpendicular to the cab. As Uncle John rounded the corner and started back between 2 more rows, he shouted out the open window, "Stack 'em high and tight today. We'll save a few trips to the barn." It's easy to get lost in thought, lulled by the steady, repetitive cadence of grabbing and stacking. So I was miles away reflecting on the odd episode last night when Uncle John accelerated into a bump. With a bale overhead stretching for the top row, my flailing legs were rendered useless and I toppled off the tailgate. The bale hit the ground first and I was flung head over heels onto my back behind the truck. "Whoa!" Peter shouted, holding up a hand towards the driver's side mirror. Uncle John responded by slamming on the brakes, which, of course, sent the rest of the bales toppling down. Pops reached out a hand to help me up, but pulled it back as the driver's door swung open and Uncle John stepped out. I heard the familiar cadence of his heavy footfall jostling through the grass, made distinctive by the slight limp he'd earned as a paratrooper. Lumbering steadily towards the back of the truck, he casually observed the scattered bales. I was red in the face, somewhere between embarrassed and angry, as he picked up the bale nearest to me and slammed it down on the tailgate. "You gotta learn to stack these things tighter. I ain't picking up behind you all day." He winked at his friends as he headed back towards the front of the truck. Pops and Peters exploded in laughter. It's a wonder that no one ever got killed during one of his pranks, at least that I was aware of. He'd only finished grade school, but long years in the field using his body as a tool had lent him a working comprehension of physics and a rather impeccable sense of timing. I knew this was his favorite trick, but I'd fallen for it again. I restacked the truck carefully and we continued down the row. It wasn't long before we were fully loaded, stacked high and tight, So Peter signaled to Uncle John to head for the barn. I'd filled countless barns with hay, but this one had always stood out in my mind. In most regards, it wasn't unlike any other barn in this part of the country. Old and rickety, with steps that looked less than trustworthy and hay twine twisted around every post, tying off every stall door and hanging from virtually every exposed nail. And when there were no more exposed nails to hang twine from, Uncle John would hammer a new one in. Like most of the depression-forged old men I know, he just couldn't bear with the thought of throwing out anything that might be of use someday, no matter how unlikely that was. But though this barn was normal, there was one exception: the loft. Most simple lofts were built to a height at which a man standing in the bed of a truck could climb in, but this one had a very narrow door set some 12 feet or more above the ground. I suppose in a climate where self-image is dependent almost solely on how hard you work, it only makes sense to overburden every task with a voracious appetite for inefficiency. So I went about the business of tossing the bales up, running up the stairs to the loft to stack them away, and then rushing back down to repeat. Uncle John, maybe feeling empathetic to my plight, soon climbed into the bed to help toss up the bales. We quickly fell into a rhythm, tossing and stacking, until the work melted into dance yet again. He'd let one sail, I'd grab the bale, 4 steps back, turn, and stack. Then I'd hop down into the truck and we'd be off for another load. A few hours and 5.5 loads later, I tucked the last bale into the loft just as the sun crested overhead. I leapt down into the truck beside Uncle John, pulling the thin leather gloves from my hands as I sat on the edge of the bed. I hadn't noticed from up above, but Uncle John's face was pale beneath the shadow of his hat bill. Perspiration dripped down his forehead, tracing the deep wrinkles around his narrowed eyes to beat at his temple. "Give me a minute," he said as he slid over the side of the truck and walked towards his pickup, flexing his hands into and out of fists as he went. Leaning against the hood of the truck talking, Pops and Peters didn't notice. I leapt to the ground and joined them, resting against the blackjack oak and scratching my back against its deep, rough bark as I brushed the day's accumulated filth from the hair on my arms. I watched from a distance as Uncle John opened the passenger door and fumbled around in the glove box. His truck manual, some random receipts, and a .22 handgun fell out onto the floorboard as he searched for and finally found an orangish pill bottle. He struggled with the lid for a moment before coercing it loose, several tiny white nitroglycerin pills spilling through his shaking hands before he finally grasped one to tuck below his tongue. I knew better than to upset him by mentioning it, or by drawing the others' attention to it. We had a combined 180 years of hay-hauling experience among us, and as impressive as that may sound, it also meant the field wasn't exactly brimming with the vitality of youth. I'd seen them ailing more than once, but their steady, plodding dedication to seeing the job through ultimately won every day, no matter the cost. In fact, it was this very same pasture in which last summer I'd found Uncle John, just a day after surgery to remove a staph infection from his brainstem, feverishly working the handles of a post-hole digger into the hard clay with a halo screwed tightly into his immobilized skull. The idea of Uncle John with a halo of any kind still makes me laugh, but I wasn't concerned. That was just Uncle John. Unstoppable. Some moments later, he closed the pickup door behind him and made his way over towards Peter's hood to join us. I looked away as he approached, pretending to be none the wiser. Now, in the wake of a huge job outlasted, we took a moment to participate in the most essential ritual of hay hauling, shooting the breeze. Let's face it, none of us was there for the wage. I was paid $5 an hour, which in the inflation-absent minds of those old men may have seemed my weight in gold, but to me, it seemed disproportionate to the pain and suffering to which I had just subjected myself. That was all right, though. I was there for something else, although I couldn't say I knew exactly what. They, on the other hand, were paid nothing. They lived by a simple system. When someone needed help, they were there. Upon completion of the job, the recipient of help, not one to accept charity, would offer payment, although he had no intention of actually paying. In fact, he probably didn't even have the money. That was okay, because it was a foregone conclusion that the provider would reject payment indiscreetly on the grounds of friendship, being neighborly, or the fact that it all comes out in the wash anyhow, so to speak. The job was done, everyone's pride intact, and no one was any the poorer for it. A noble system, no doubt, but one that would likely be put to rest with these old friends. Uncle John still looked a bit flushed, with large beads of sweat rolling down his cheek from beneath his hat. I opened my mouth slightly, wondering how to ask if he was okay, but before I could, "So, Billy, you tell Pops and Peters about that critter I found in the woods this morning?" Uncle John grinned as wide as the creek, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a sleeve and steadying a slight tremble in his hand. "No, sir. Didn't figure on it neither." "Oh, now, come on. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. You're amongst friends, right?" I shook my head as my cheeks began to redden, but it was too late. He was already winding up. "So, I'm coming up the holler before sunrise this morning, checking my traps for that coyote that's been running the cows. And I'm working up towards the old barn when I see something rustling in the briars. It's darker than hell, so I ease up my 30-30, get down on the sights, and slip up behind it. That's when I came across something all curled up in the underbrush." He paused, stone-faced. "Coyote?" Pops asked. "Nah." "Bobcat?" Peter said. "Nah, just old Billy, curled up in his skimpies." I clenched my teeth and shook my head. I'd been around these old men long enough to know that nothing was sacred. Around here, public humiliation was a rite of passage. "Oh, Billy, you sleepwalking again?" Peters asked. "Yeah, guess so," I said, scratching the back of my dirty neck, eyes cast away. "Sleepwalking? Hell, that's putting it mildly. This is something else," Uncle John said. "Why you figure it happens to you?" Peters asked. I wish I knew. I didn't have the answers, but I'd sure read enough about it. "You ever had a nightmare so scary that it wakes you up?" I asked. He nodded. "And have you ever had that feeling, just for a split second, that you can't move, like you're paralyzed?" "Think so," Peter said, nodding. "Well, that's 'cause you are. It's called sleep paralysis. Some hormone or chemical or something relaxes your muscles while you sleep. It's normal. Goes away real quick when you wake up. It's what keeps you from acting out your dreams." "And you ain't got that?" he asked. "Guess not," I shrugged. "I can unlock doors, open windows, wander out into the yard, all kinds of stuff. I'm not quite asleep, but I sure ain't awake neither." "Seen lots of guys with them during the war. Night terrors, they call them. Stress, I guess. Although I can't imagine what on God's green earth you have to be stressed about," Uncle John said. I shook my head before continuing. "It's some type of parasomnia or something. REM disorder, I think. I don't know. Heck, they don't even know why we sleep, much less what happens while we're doing it," I said, raising my hands and shrugging again. We sat for a moment in welcome silence as the conversation came to a natural pause. We looked out across the now empty field, settling into the landscape as it slowly forgot we were there. The electric hum of cicada filled the air, vibrating through the tall pines in an incessant buzz. They were particularly loud today, which was odd for this time of year, as their ritual was more typical of July and August. The hardwoods along the fence row, bordering the creek, were alive with the mournful coo of dove, roosted down for the hot afternoon in the shady woods. I closed my eyes and listened, wishing it would never end. Suddenly, A shrill sound began to overpower the steady chorus of nature. I turned back to the road to see a Jefferson County Sheriff cruiser speeding by and disappearing beyond the tree line towards the creek, the fire truck right behind.